In the late autumn of 1887, in the high desert country north of Prescott in Arizona Territory, a young woman named Vera Collum arrived at the Yavapai County Land Office with a single silver dollar and a surveyor's canvas satchel worn thin at the strap. She was 24 years old. Her father had died in June and left nothing but a name on a deed that his brother's lawyers had already begun to contest. The house was gone by September. The workshop was gone a week after that. By October, she was boarding with the widow of a teamster in a room above a feed store, mending whatever the widow could not mend, and reading the legal notices in the back pages of the Weekly Miner by lamplight each night. That was the only education her father had told her never to let anyone take from her. Read the document, Vera. Read it twice. A survey plat will tell you more than any man alive if you know the language it speaks. She had learned the language. Her father, Elias Collum, had been a government land survey field assistant for 11 years before his joints failed him, and for 8 of those years, he had taken Vera into the field alongside him whenever school did not require her presence. She had held the surveying rod at 9 years old, had called out degrees from the compass at 11, had understood the concept of a closing error before she had understood long division. When the field notebooks came out at night, she had read them by firelight in the tent they shared, and she had understood before she was 14 that land in Arizona Territory was not what most people believed it to be. It was not dirt and rock. It was a record. Everything under the earth and everything on its surface had been described, numbered, and entered somewhere, and the entries told a story that the dirt itself never changed. Those years in the field had cost her father something. She saw it clearly now, in the way she had not been able to see it as a child. He was a careful man, methodical and patient, and he had spent the better part of a decade walking ground that other men would never bother to inspect, writing down what he found without embellishment or complaint, and filing his reports with an agency that paid him $40 a month and offered him no path to any other life. He had not complained about this arrangement. He had said more than once that knowing the land was its own reward and that the record would outlast everything. She had believed him as a child because she had no reason not to. She believed him now for entirely different reasons. The claim that appeared in the legal notices on the 14th of October was listed under the forfeiture and abandonment column. The parcel was identified as Mineral Claim Survey number 118, Walnut Canyon Precinct, 1 3/4 acres, last worked 1874. The holding fee had gone unpaid for 12 consecutive years. The assessed value of the surface improvements was listed as nil. The county was offering it at $1 to recover administrative costs. No other bidder had appeared in the 6 weeks since the notice first ran. The notice was 3 lines. Most readers would have passed over it without stopping. Vera read it 4 times. She knew what Walnut Canyon Precinct meant. Her father had surveyed the eastern edge of that precinct in 1878, and she had been with him for part of it, sitting on the tailgate of the buckboard while he worked the chain with his assistant. She remembered the canyon walls were limestone, pale and layered, with seams of darker material running through them at intervals. She remembered her father pausing at one such seam and saying, with his level professional voice, that the survey report would call this country unproductive because it was his job to describe what he found and not to speculate. He had paused there for a moment. Then he had said this: "The report is what they will file. What they miss is something else." She hadn't known what he meant that day. In the 12 years since, she had thought about it with some frequency. On the morning of the 16th of October, she paid $1 to the county clerk, a man named Purcell who signed the transfer deed without looking up from his desk, and she walked out into the autumn sun with a notarized copy folded in her satchel and a piece of land she had never set foot on. She was the owner. The word felt strange in the mouth. But the paper said it plainly, and the paper was the thing that counted. If you have ever been the last person anyone expected to turn up at a county land office, the last person whose name anyone thought would appear on a deed, you may understand something of what Vera Column carried across the street that morning. It is not pride exactly, and it is not relief. It is something quieter than either. Leave a thought below if you know that feeling. There are more stories like this one waiting here. The ride out to the claim took most of a day. Vera had borrowed the widow's mule and a lantern, and she packed 3 days of provisions and her father's field kit, the compass, the survey chain, the rod, the plumb bob, the notebooks with his handwriting in them. She left before first light and arrived at the canyon mouth in the early afternoon, when the sun was still high enough to illuminate the western wall. She tied the mule to a juniper and walked into the canyon on foot. The access track had grown over almost entirely, 2 parallel ruts just barely visible through the scrub oak and creosote. She followed them anyway, stepping over a fallen branch of catclaw acacia, ducking under the overhang of a juniper that had grown out sideways from a crack in the canyon wall. The canyon narrowed as she moved deeper into it, the pale limestone faces rising on either side, the shadows between them cool and mineral-smelling even in October, even in the warmth of the afternoon sun. She walked slowly, reading the walls as her father had taught her to read them, noting the layer sequence, the dip of the strata, the places where the limestone changed color or texture in ways that did not follow the ordinary horizontal pattern. The claim was a rectangular parcel, 1 3/4 acres, bounded on the north by the canyon wall and on the south by a dry wash. At the far end of the parcel, near the canyon wall, she found what remained of the surface improvements the county deed had valued at Neal. A collapsed timber frame, perhaps 12 feet by 8, with a rusted iron stovepipe still standing upright among the fallen boards, and a shaft entrance cut directly into the limestone face of the canyon wall. The shaft entrance was horizontal, about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, sealed across its face with a rough timber door hung on iron pintles. The door had swollen in its frame over the years and would not open without pressure. Someone had driven a wedge of scrap iron between the door and the frame at some point, possibly to keep it from being forced by weather or animals. The iron wedge had rusted in place. Vera stood in front of it for a long time. She was not thinking about what might be inside. She was thinking about the angle of the canyon wall above the entrance, the way the limestone layers ran, and the dark band of material she could see cutting through the pale rock about 30 feet above the drift mouth. Her father had noted that band in his 1878 survey. She had found the entry 2 nights ago in his field notebook, the one she had carried in her satchel since his death. The notation was brief, a seam of dense gray material approximately 18 inches wide, bearing northeast, consistent in character with secondary mineral deposition, not economically significant by current assessment. The assessment notation had been added later in a different pen, in handwriting that was not her father's. She had spent considerable time studying those 4 words in his notebook, in the lamplight above the feed store, comparing the pen strokes to every other entry on the page. His lettering was small and compressed, made with a fine-point pen he sharpened himself. The 4 added words were in a broader hand, written with a different instrument. Someone had opened his notebook after the fact. Someone had added 4 words to his entry and closed the notebook again, and neither the General Land Office nor anyone else had ever had cause to compare the ink. She copied the entry and the annotation both into her own notebook and drew a fresh sketch of the canyon wall with compass bearings. Then she went to work on the door. The wedge came out after an hour, with a cold chisel and a hammer from the field kit. The door itself required both hands and all her weight thrown against it 3 times before it gave, swinging inward on the upper panel and dropping at the lower where the wood had rotted away from the iron. She caught it before it fell entirely and propped it against the frame. Cold air moved out of the shaft opening, slow and mineral-smelling, the smell of sealed rock and old timber, and the faint metallic trace of something she could not name precisely, but recognized at a distance, the way a person recognizes the particular stillness of a room that has been closed for many years. She held the lantern at the threshold and looked in. The drift was short, 12 feet, perhaps 14. The floor was packed earth and fractured limestone, reasonably level. The walls were hand-cut. The marks of the single jack and hand drill still visible in the rock face on either side. The holes drilled in the pattern she recognized from her father's descriptions of single-man, hard rock work. The shallow holes were for exploratory sampling. The deeper ones were for blast loading. There had been blasting done here more than once. The debris had been cleared and the floor leveled, which meant someone had worked this ground seriously enough to process the cut material. This was not a prospect hole. This was a claim with time invested in it. At the far end of the drift, where the face of the limestone had been most recently worked, someone had stacked a set of shallow wooden trays, the kind used for sorting and washing ore samples. There were 7 of them, stacked on a rough plank shelf. On the shelf beside them sat a glass specimen jar with a cork stopper, still intact, and inside it a quantity of material that had not degraded in 13 years of sealed storage. She set the lantern on the floor and lifted the jar carefully. The material inside was dark gray to black, granular with a dull metallic luster that caught the lantern light when she tilted it. She turned the jar slowly. She had seen this material before, in her father's sample collection, in a small wooden box he kept on the workshop shelf and never offered for sale. He had called it secondary silver ore, tetrahedrite, what the Mexican miners working the deep operations south of the border called gray copper. He had told her it was worth knowing on sight and easy to miss if you were looking for the bright thing. The bright thing, he had said, is what the crowd follows. The gray thing is what the crowd walks past. The jar held perhaps a quarter pound of material. She would need to weigh it properly and have it assayed to know its grade. But the visual character wasn't ambiguous. She had spent enough hours with her father's samples to recognize what she was looking at. She set the jar back on the shelf and picked up the wooden trays one by one. The trays were not empty. Under the stacked forms, she found what she had not expected to find. Not more samples, but a packet of papers, folded twice and wrapped in oilcloth, tied with cord that had dried and stiffened, but had not rotted through. The wrapping had done its work. She cut the cord with her folding knife and unwrapped it carefully on the cleanest section of the floor. Inside were 6 documents. 3 were assay certificates from the Prescott Sampling and Assay Works, dated between 1872 and 1874. 2 were correspondence letters, handwritten on company letterhead, from an entity called the Consolidated Western Mineral Development Corporation, addressed to a man named Harlan Mapes at a postal address in Prescott. The 6th was a survey plat, hand-drafted, covering approximately 40 acres of Walnut Canyon Precinct, including the parcel she now owned, annotated in pencil with figures she recognized immediately as bulk grade estimates. She read the assay certificates first. The 3 samples they described came from this drift and from 2 adjacent locations slightly north, on ground that lay outside the boundaries of Claim Survey number 118. The grades were not exceptional. No single sample ran above $3 per ton on silver content alone, but there were annotations in the margins of 2 certificates, added in a different hand from the assayer's printed entries, that changed the calculation entirely. The annotations identified a probable depth extension, a structural argument based on the angle of the limestone seam and the grade progression between samples, that the mineralized zone almost certainly widened and enriched at depth. The annotations were technically competent. They were the work of someone who understood hard rock geology, not a promoter. Vera read the correspondence next. The first letter, dated March of 1874, was from the Consolidated Western Mineral Development Corporation and addressed to Harlan Mapes. It acknowledged receipt of the 3 assay certificates and the annotated plat. It offered to purchase outright the surface and mineral rights to the 40-acre block at a price of $300 total for all parcels. The letter described the ground as marginally promising at best and noted that the company was acquiring it primarily to consolidate its existing holdings in the district. $300 for 40 acres of ground that the company's own letter described as marginal. She held the letter for a moment and then set it down. The second letter, dated April of 1874, was from the same corporation and addressed to the same man. It was shorter. It confirmed that no survey had been formally filed with the county on the subject parcels as of the date of writing, and that the corporation would handle the filing of a consolidated survey on completion of purchase. It noted in a concluding paragraph rendered in the same flat administrative language as the rest of the letter that the matter of the original claimant's survey observations would not be carried forward in the consolidated filing. She read that sentence 3 times. The survey observations would not be carried forward. Her father's handwriting was in those observations. His notation of the secondary mineral seam, written in 1878, had been added to a county survey record that the Consolidated Western Mineral Development Corporation had already told a man named Harlan Mapes it would control by 1874. The survey her father had conducted had been official government work, filed with the General Land Office. But the earlier private survey, the one attached to these assay certificates, the one that showed the 40-acre block and its grade annotations, had never been filed at all. The county records she had read at the land office showed only the individual claims, each assessed separately at values that matched the surface improvements and nothing else. The depth extension, the grade progression, the structural argument for enrichment below the current working level. None of it had ever appeared in any public record. She sat on the drift floor with the lantern and the papers for a long time. Outside the drift mouth, the canyon was beginning to dim toward evening, the last direct light withdrawing up the western wall toward the rim. The lantern flame held steady in the windless air. What she held was not treasure, precisely. It was something more durable and more useful than treasure. It was the record of a decision made in a particular year by a particular corporation, a decision to ensure that a body of geological evidence never reached the county files or the General Land Office, so that 40 acres of mineral ground could be acquired at a price that bore no relationship to its actual character. Harlan Mapes had apparently agreed to the terms, and the claim had eventually been forfeited for non-payment of fees, either because the corporation had not filed the consolidated survey it promised, or because Mapes had departed the territory. Either way, the ground had sat unworked and unrecorded for 13 years, and the parcel that held the drift and the specimen jar and the oilcloth packet had been sold for $1 to recover administrative costs. It was now her dollar's worth of ground. She replaced the papers in the oilcloth, retied the cord as best she could with stiffened cord and careful hands, and tucked the packet into her satchel beside her own field notebook. Outside, the canyon had gone to shadow, the sun having moved behind the western wall. She stood at the drift mouth for a moment and looked up at the limestone face, at the dark seam running northeast through the pale rock 30 feet above her. And she thought about her father standing in this same canyon in 1878, pausing at that same seam with his survey chain, and his careful professional language, writing down what he found without speculation, and someone, at some point thereafter, adding 4 words to his entry in a different pen. Not economically significant by current assessment. She did not know whose hand had added those 4 words. She intended to find out. The ride back took most of the evening and part of the night. The mule moved steadily on the dark road, ears forward, trusting the familiar smell of the Prescott Valley ahead. Vera sat straight in the saddle with her satchel across her lap and her father's plumb bob hanging at her hip, where it always hung when she worked, still warm from the day's use. By the time she stabled the mule, it was past 10 o'clock. She sat at the widow's kitchen table with the papers spread out, and her father's notebooks open beside them and a candle burning down to its socket, and she worked through the documents systematically, in the order a land recorder would require, making clean copies in her own hand, with every date and figure and party name accounted for. By the time she had finished, she had a clear picture of what had happened in Walnut Canyon Precinct in the spring of 1874. The Consolidated Western Mineral Development Corporation had known, from privately commissioned surveys and assay work, that the 40-acre block contained a mineralized zone with probable depth enrichment. It had acquired the claims in that block at suppressed prices by negotiating directly with the claimants before any of the geological evidence was filed in public records. When the corporation subsequently controlled all of the relevant ground, it had filed a consolidated survey that described the parcel values in terms that matched the suppressed purchase prices, not the assay evidence. Any subsequent purchaser, any county assessor, any land officer reviewing the record would find nothing in the public files to suggest the ground was worth more than its surface appearance. But the evidence itself had not been destroyed. It had been left in the drift, wrapped in oilcloth, presumably forgotten or abandoned when Harlan Mapes forfeited the claim. The corporation had not vanished. She had recognized the name from the mining journal files she had read at the assay office during her father's final illness, when she had been looking for work and had gone through the territorial business records methodically. The Consolidated Western Mineral Development Corporation had reorganized in 1880 as the Western Prescott Mining and Land Trust and still held assets in Yavapai County. It still filed quarterly reports. It still had a registered agent. What it did not have, and had not had for 13 years, was control of the drift and the papers inside it. In the morning, she went to the county courthouse. She went first to the land recorder's office, where she requested the survey and transfer history for the 40-acre block surrounding Claim Survey, number 118. The records clerk, a young man who was clearly bored, produced 3 index cards and a rolled survey plat that took him several minutes to locate. She spread the plat on the reading counter and compared it against the hand-drafted plat from the oilcloth packet. The omissions were precise and consistent. The Consolidated Survey, filed in 1875, a year after the corporation's letters, showed grade descriptions that were identical in language to the surface assessments on the individual claim deeds, not the assay evidence. The depth extension annotations that appeared in the private plat were entirely absent. The 40-acre block had been assessed at a total value of $460. The last quarterly report of the Western Prescott Mining and Land Trust showed its Walnut Canyon holdings valued at $900, a figure that had not changed in 7 years. She asked the records clerk how one filed a formal survey amendment. He stared at her. She explained that she was the holder of Claim Survey number 118 by transfer deed and had cause to believe the original survey filing for the surrounding block contained material omissions. She was prepared to file a corrected plat with supporting documentation. The clerk told her she would need the county surveyor to certify any corrected plat. She said she understood that. She asked for the form. He found the form after a while. She thanked him and left. The county surveyor was a man named Asa Webb, who had held the office for 9 years, and who received her that afternoon in a small office behind the courthouse that smelled of pine sap and old paper. He was 60 perhaps, with a full gray beard and the hands of a man who had spent considerable time outdoors. He looked at her satchel, at the transit case she had borrowed for the appointment, at the notebooks she placed on his desk, and his expression was the careful neutral of a man who had learned not to reveal his assessment of a situation until he had more information. She laid the 3 assay certificates on his desk. She laid the correspondence letters beside them. She laid the hand-drafted plat over the correspondence. She said nothing for a moment and let him read. He read slowly and methodically, going back twice to the grade annotations on the certificates. After several minutes, he looked up. "Where did you find these?" he said. She told him about the drift, about the oilcloth packet, about the specimen jar. He looked down at the plat again. "The depth extension argument," he said, and it was not a question. "They had this in 1874. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a long time. He picked up one of the assay certificates and held it to the window light, set it down, picked up the second letter from the corporation and read the concluding paragraph again, the one about the survey observations that would not be carried forward. "You own the ground where this drift is," he said. "I do. Transfer deed from the county, October 16th. And these papers were in the drift?" "Yes." He set the letter down on the desk and folded his hands over it. "I have been county surveyor for 9 years," he said, "and I can tell you that the consolidated survey filed for that block in 1875 is the worst piece of work I have ever seen recorded in this office. I said so when I reviewed the files 4 years ago. I was told the original surveyor was no longer in the territory and the matter was closed." She waited. "It is not closed," he said. He pulled a blank survey certificate from a drawer of his desk and uncapped his pen. The process took 6 weeks. Vera walked the ground 3 times with Asa Webb and twice with a field assistant from the General Land Office in Prescott, who had been dispatched from Phoenix after Webb's formal inquiry. She ran the survey chain herself for the eastern boundary at Webb's request, because his assistant had twisted an ankle on the first day, and she was the only other person on the site who could run a plumb bob in rocky ground without error. The work was cold and slow, the canyon walls in shadow for most of the day by November, the ground hard underfoot. She wore her father's heavy canvas work coat and kept the compass warm inside her sleeve between readings. Webb watched her work without comment the first time. The second time, he made a single notation in his field book that she would only see later, when he showed it to her before the final filing. The notation read, "Competent fieldwork. Original claimant's daughter." She read those 5 words and then looked up at him. He said nothing, which was his way, and folded the notebook closed. The General Land Office investigator, a man named Tate who had the flat, precise manner of a man accustomed to reading through falsehood in printed documents, spent 4 days at the courthouse reviewing records. He was not the type to explain his methods while he was using them. He arrived with a leather document case and left the courthouse each evening without speaking to anyone, except the records clerk. On the 4th day, he stopped at Vera's boarding room where she was working on the corrected plat, and asked her 3 questions about the drift dimensions and the location of the oilcloth packet relative to the sample trays. He wrote her answers in a small notebook. He thanked her and left. He found 3 additional properties in Yavapai County, where the Western Prescott Mining and Land Trust held assessments that appeared inconsistent with the geological character of the ground, based on the same methodological signature visible in the Walnut Canyon filing. The properties were scattered across the county, each filed by a different surveyor in a different year. But the pattern of omission was the same in every case. Grade annotations absent. Depth projections absent. The assessed values tethered to surface appearance and nothing beneath it. He made no public statement about what he found. He filed a report with the General Land Office in Washington and a separate report with the Territorial Attorney General's office in Phoenix, and he departed Prescott on the morning stage without stopping again at the county surveyor's office or at Vera's boarding room. Vera was not consulted about either report. She read about the filing in the Weekly Miner 6 weeks after it occurred, 2 lines in the business notices. She did not expect to be consulted. The work of correction was institutional and slow, and her part in it was to provide the document trail and the surveyed evidence, which she had done. What happened to the Western Prescott Mining and Land Trust in the years that followed was a matter for courts and offices that did not require her presence. She had heard, by way of the county recorder's clerk, that the trust's registered agent had quietly departed Prescott in November. She did not know what had become of him. It was not her concern. What was her concern sat at the upper end of Claim Survey number 118, sealed in a specimen jar on a rough plank shelf, and she had spent the intervening weeks making a proper assay of it. The quarter-pound sample ran $11 per ton in silver equivalent at the current price. Not a bonanza. Not the kind of figure that made men leave their families and walk into the desert on a rumor. But the depth extension argument in the private plat had been technically sound, and when she and Asa Webb had surveyed the full extent of the mineralized seam, they had mapped it running 300 feet along the canyon wall, with the dark band still present and undiminished at both ends of the survey line. What that meant, in practical terms, was that the accessible portion of the seam was substantially larger than any surface assessment had ever reflected, and that the grade, under pressure and at depth, would almost certainly improve. This was not speculation. This was a structural argument grounded in the documented character of the limestone formation and the consistent behavior of secondary silver deposition in that class of rock. She had read enough of her father's field notes on the subject to state the argument in technical language that a mining engineer would recognize. She had written it out twice and checked her reasoning against his notes a third time before she was satisfied. She filed for an extended mining claim on the ground immediately adjacent to survey number 118, 300 feet along the seam's bearing in early December. The fee was $4. She paid it from what remained of her boarding money. She did not have the capital to develop the ground herself. She knew this and had known it from the beginning. Development was not the point. The point was the record. The assay certificates, the corrected plat, the formal survey amendment, the depth extension annotations now carried forward in the official filing where they should have been carried in 1875. The point was that the next person who read the county records would find the true geological character of this ground, described accurately, not suppressed. In January, a mining engineer from San Francisco named Aldrich, who had been following the General Land Office report with interest, sent a letter to the county surveyor's office requesting the corrected survey and the supporting documentation. Webb forwarded the packet and included at his own initiative a note indicating that the field survey work had been conducted in part by the registered holder of Claim Survey number 118. Aldrich arrived in Prescott in February and asked to meet her. She met him at the county surveyor's office, with Webb present, and she answered his questions about the survey methodology and the geological interpretation with the same level precision she used for everything. He was a careful listener, the kind of man who took notes in the margins of his own notes and did not interrupt a speaker when the speaker was being precise. He asked about the specimen jar and the assay grade. She produced both reports, the preliminary assessment and the certified assay from the sampling works. He studied them for a while. He looked at the corrected plat. He asked about the depth extension, and she walked him through the structural argument, pointing to the grade progression between the 3 original sample locations and the bearing of the seam as she had surveyed it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your father was Elias Collum," he said. "Yes." "I read his General Land Office reports from the early 80s. He was thorough." She said nothing. He offered to buy an option on the mineral rights to her combined claim at a figure that she wrote down on a piece of paper and read twice before she responded. The figure represented more money than her family had earned in any consecutive 2-year period during her father's working life. She told him she would require 3 days to review the option terms and consult the survey record one final time. He said that was entirely reasonable. She spent those 3 days at the drift, working alone in the early mornings before the light got too sharp, running the survey chain along the eastern boundary of the extended claim, checking her own work. The canyon was cold at that hour, the limestone walls holding the night air well past sunrise, the junipers along the rim still frosted where the shadows had not yet broken. She worked methodically and without haste, the way her father had taught her to work, the way that got things done right rather than quickly. Her father's plumb bob hung from the rod, catching the thin winter sunlight, swinging level in the still air of the canyon. It was a small thing, brass, hexagonal, with a steel tip worn bright from years of use. She had carried it in her satchel since June, since the morning after he died, when she had opened his kit and transferred the plumb bob to her own without thinking much about it. It had not left her person since. On the morning of the 3rd day, she stood at the north boundary of the extended claim and looked back along the survey line to where she had set the rod at the south end, and the line was clean and true, the measurement closing without error. She made a note of the closing figure in her field book and then stood for a moment in the silence of the canyon. The dark seam above her ran from one end of the survey line to the other and beyond, continuing into ground she did not own and could not claim, ground that would be assessed and filed and argued over by other people in the years ahead. Her part of it was marked and measured and recorded. That was enough. She accepted the option. The instrument of agreement was drawn up at the county recorder's office, witnessed by Asa Webb, and filed that afternoon. Purcell, the same clerk who had signed her transfer deed in October without looking up, recorded the instrument and did look up this time, briefly, with the expression of a man recalculating something he had previously considered settled. She paid the widow 3 months' board from the advance and moved her possessions back to her father's workshop space, which she had rented on a month-to-month basis from the new owner, a hardware dealer who had no use for it and was glad of the income. The space was cold when she arrived, the small iron stove not yet lit, the single north-facing window admitting a gray midwinter light that fell without warmth across the workbench. She built a fire first. Then she unpacked methodically, the way her father had taught her to unpack after a field season, each instrument back in its designated place before she allowed herself to rest. She hung his transit case on the wall peg, where it had always hung, and set his field notebooks on the shelf above the workbench, and put her own notebooks beside them in chronological order, the oldest at the left and the newest at the right. His handwriting ran through the older volumes, hers through the recent ones, and there was one notebook in the middle where the handwriting switched mid-page because she had been the one to finish the last entry after his hands were no longer steady enough. The workshop smelled of pine pitch and iron filings and the particular dry dust of survey paper. It smelled like her childhood. It smelled like work waiting to be done. There was more work to do in Walnut Canyon. There was more work to do in Yavapai County, for that matter, because the General Land Office investigator's report had implied as much, and she had read the report twice and understood its implications better than the Weekly Miner had. 3 properties with the same methodological signature. 3 parcels where the assessed value bore no clear relationship to the geological character of the ground, assessed by a surveyor operating under the same constraints, filing reports that described what was convenient rather than what was true. She had the corrected plat. She had the assay certificates. She had the survey chain and the compass, and 12 years of her father's teaching carried in her hands and her eyes. She had, in the corner of the workbench, the specimen jar with its dark, granular contents, labeled now in her own careful hand, filed as evidence in the county recorder's office and in the general land office record both. She had the corrected survey for the Walnut Canyon block, carrying forward the depth extension annotations that should have appeared there in 1875, sitting in the public file where anyone who came after her could read it. The record would outlast everything. He had been right about that. Outside, the winter sun was low and cold over the western ridgeline, laying long shadows across the pale limestone dust of the road. She set the specimen jar on the workbench where the last of the afternoon light caught the dark, granular material inside, and held it steady. Gray, dense, dull lustrous, easy to miss if you were following the bright thing. She was not following the bright thing. She opened the survey notebook to the next blank page and wrote the date at the top. The 17th of February, 1888. Below it, she wrote 3 property descriptions, copied from memory from the General Land Office report, and beside each one she noted the bearing and character of the geological feature that connected them to the Walnut Canyon Formation. Then she picked up her pen and began to draw. There are people who spend their whole lives looking past things like that specimen jar, past the gray and the dull and the difficult, toward whatever the crowd has already declared to be worth wanting. She is not the only woman who showed up at a county land office with almost nothing and walked out with the beginning of something. If this story stayed with you, leave a word below. And if you want to hear about the others, there are more stories like this one here. This account and the characters within it are drawn from the kinds of survey disputes and mineral claim irregularities that genuinely marked the territorial land offices of the American West in the 1870s and 1880s. The protagonist is a fictional figure, but the methods she used, the documents she recovered, and the institutional machinery she engaged were all real features of that world.